I'd like you to open up your Bibles to the book of Romans chapter 12, and we'll begin looking there in just a moment. Romans chapter 12. As Robert mentioned, we're going to be returning to the subject of justice this morning, and our focus is not going to be the same as the songs that we sang, but His justice, God's justice, and His consistency and our reliance on Him is the foundation for everything we are talking about. And that's what we need to be looking at. It is not our own sense of justice that is the foundation. In fact, so much injustice is practiced because that is the basis for a lot of people's sense of justice. Very often what we have to do is rein our own sense of justice in. Or maybe excite some sense of justice that isn't there from God's word. But His word is what must train us in every effort. As we looked last time, our focus was on the definition of justice. What is it exactly in biblical terms? Additionally, we looked at the principle of consistency. That principle that casts out all double standards. That principle that is laid out in what we often call the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so as we're thinking through justice and we think about about the way certain things should be, we want to make sure that we still comply or still believe in that aspect of justice, no matter which side of the bar we stand on. Whether you are the accuser or the accused, the judge, or the bystander. If your sense of justice changes depending on where you are, then you're not keeping that principle in compliance. But, of course, our own consistency is not the only standard. And so I want to turn again to God's word this morning to look at the notion of understanding justice. That's what Solomon prayed for in 1 Kings chapter 3. Among the things that he asked God for was the ability to understand justice. And that's what we want to do, understand it from God's perspective. And then there's a couple of areas that I want to add to the discussion this morning. And they really largely, in some sense, both cases, involve our limits. I want to focus particularly on that to begin with, our limited capacity and how that affects our practice of justice, our accomplishment of justice. The notion that we are not going to be able to right all the wrongs is a principle that must be accepted if we are to practice justice. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 19, Romans chapter 12 and verse 19, and talking about good people who are engaging with wicked people and what we ought to do, what our response ought to be. He says there, never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. There needs to be a confidence that justice will always eventually be addressed, but not always by us. That we may not always get to see it, and we certainly may not always get to accomplish it. The reason that this is so important is that we need to understand that no matter what wickedness and no matter what injustice we see in this world, we will always find that there is a point we reach where our abilities to accomplish justice ends. What does not end is our ability to do more harm. And so sometimes we get all the way up to that point where really there's not anything else we can do, but then we want to do some more. And what generally will happen is we've ceased actually accomplishing justice, and what we've begun doing without knowing it, because we're all focused over here, is we begin to accomplish more injustice. And that is so often the case. That we see great injustices, or maybe we see some injustice that something can be done about, and we accomplish that. We actually make things better and more fair. But then we say, and this is a mantra in American history, there's more work to do. And I don't know that there always is. not in every particular, not in every area. I talked to my granddad years ago about unions, for instance. And he talked about, some of the working conditions that he had seen in his lifetime. And unions come in and they note the injustices of the workplace, and then they would come and they would try to bargain and push for better working conditions. But then they get those. And he said, here were union workers making more than really anybody else around them. But then what would they say? There's still work to do. And they pressed and they pressed and they kept going farther until they damaged the very ones that they were supposedly trying to help. That's just one example where we go and we say we're going to address these injustices. One of the words that I hear thrown about these days is the word microaggression. Maybe you've heard that word, maybe you haven't. The idea is that there are obvious offenses. There are things that everybody would agree that's an offensive thing to say or do. But many of those very obvious offenses have been sort of driven out of the public space. They've been shamed out and they're just not acceptable in public life. So what people have done is said, okay, we've handled that. Now let's deal with the unseen. Let's deal with the microaggression. And the microaggression is the thing that is so small, people don't even notice it. And in fact, I suggest to you it's so small, maybe it doesn't even exist. Maybe it's not actually an aggression, but people are looking for a grievance sometimes. They want there to be something there. And so we need to know where the lines are. We need to know, okay, at this point, maybe there is still an offense there. Maybe there is something that someone is still doing that's unjust. But maybe it's past the line where I can actually do something about it. And I need to know where that line is so I don't continue down a path that may actually cause more harm than good. Along those lines, looking at our limitations, we simply do not have the power. I want to kind of define some of these limits. We don't have the power to address all the injustices. Maybe somebody does, but maybe I particularly don't have the power. I think something of that is going on in Matthew chapter 5 when Jesus is addressing the, misconception of the teaching an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You've heard that it was said, he quotes, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Now, I think that in the context of the particulars that Jesus brings up, that is very likely he is talking about the sorts of personal offenses that Jewish people especially had to deal with being non-citizens in a Roman world. That these are the sorts of offenses that could be heaped upon them by people who were in greater power, who had greater privileges than they did, so that they could be slapped in the face. They could be compelled to walk with a Roman soldier 1 mile. They could be sued for their goods. And Jesus gives these people a different path than fighting back, which incidentally would have been useless, right? So you're a Jewish merchant. You for whatever reason offend a Roman soldier. He slaps you in the face, and your instinct may be, well, now I have a right under God's law to slap this man back. And Jesus says, here's another option. Here's another path that you could take. Now, is it right that someone slapped this person in the face? Is it right? Is it just that someone says, walk with me, compels someone against their will to walk with them 1 mile? No, it's not. But Jesus says, one of the options, instead of fighting against that injustice, which you really can't do anything about anyway, is you could submit and actually gain from receiving the injustice. And then it becomes not so damaging. And so one of the ways that we can actually address when we don't have the power to do anything about an injustice is we can actually grow from it. We can learn from it. And I think Jesus gives these people the opportunity to do that. So very often, that's not on our radar. A lot of times we look at this passage and we think of it only in terms of taking the insult from somebody that we could actually do something against. I think it applies there too. But thinking in terms of receiving the injustice from somebody you can't do anything about anyway, there is some real distinct advantage. Because what are your other options? Well, they're not many. So here is a positive option in the face of that. Maybe somebody else is in authority over that person and they can actually address that injustice. But if I'm not, I don't have power or authority to address it, well then I've got to figure out a way to do something valuable with that. Going along those lines, we don't have the authority, not just the power. You know, maybe you're a big guy and you feel like you can kind of take this soldier that's in front of you. But then again, do you actually have the authority to do anything about that? There are jurisdictions that we need to consider. What is under our watchfulness? What is under our care that we're actually responsible for? And if we're not responsible for it, we need to know that, because we might observe it. We might say, I see that over there, but maybe I don't have a right to do anything about it. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, of course, it's talking about the home and talking about fathers and children. And there's his jurisdiction being laid out. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. I have jurisdiction in my home over my children. My jurisdiction is infinitely decreased outside of the four walls of my home. And so my jurisdiction having to do with my children, if my children come and they complain because of some interaction, for instance, with another child, one of the things that I have communicated them over and over, I am responsible for you. Which is why I asked them, what did you do? Right? Some kids, I think my kids probably think, you only care about what I'm doing. Well, in a sense, yes. I'm only responsible for what you're doing. I don't have jurisdiction. Now, I could go talk to the parents, I could go say something, but I don't actually have any authority there. And so it's very limited. It's not near so limited, the authority that I have within the home. And then again, within the home, we have jurisdictions of mothers. Titus chapter 2 and verse 5 talks about the wives being keepers at home. There's a management aspect there, being keepers at home. And so she has jurisdiction. She has management jurisdiction. And yet her jurisdiction is under that of the husband. And so her jurisdiction doesn't go the same upward as it does downward. And so she has similar jurisdiction over the children. Not everybody else's, but also not the same jurisdiction over her husband that he has over her. So we're going to be limited based on that. Another jurisdiction that we see is that of the church. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 2, as Peter's instructing the elders, it's oversee the flock which is among you. Not which is among those elders, not which is over in that city, but among you. And we make that point. We talk about church autonomy. That's a thing. That is a principle clearly laid out. And so we don't have elders. Now, that doesn't mean one eldership can't communicate with another eldership, that they cannot say, maybe inform another eldership about something. But what that eldership does over there, that's their business. So if somebody came to our eldership and they said, what are you going to do about what's happening over at the church down the road? Our elder's probably going to say, what do you mean? What are we going to do? It's not our jurisdiction. Now, again, I may know people over there and I may say something. I may ask questions. And that's not to say that you can't know anybody else's business, that we have relationships and maybe even responsibilities within those relationships. But as far as authority to actually discipline, authority to actually take action, well, we're going to be limited by the jurisdiction. Additionally, as Paul is talking about church discipline within the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he indicates Not just the limits from one church to another, but the limits from within the church to outside of the church. He says in 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 12, what have I to do with judging outsiders? Do you not judge those who are within the church? But those who are outside, God judges. Remove the wicked man from among yourselves. See, that should remind you of what we just read back over in Romans chapter 12. Vengeance is mine, I'll repay. Paul says here, when people are pointing out, said, you know there are people out there living like that? Paul says, yeah, of course. God will take care of that. That's not mine to take care of. It's certainly not the church's to take care of. We have limited jurisdiction. We have limited authority to do anything about that. And then, of course, there is the jurisdiction of the government. In Romans chapter 13, Paul presses the right and the jurisdiction of the government. Every person, he says, beginning in verse 1, is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Now, sometimes those jurisdictions clash, right? So we've got the government who says, here's a rule, here's something we are imposing, some leadership authority. And then God says, here is some requirement I have of my people. And when those two clash, we have, for instance, Acts chapter 5 and verse 29. And the consequence, the conclusion is that we ought to obey God rather than men. And so there are hierarchies of jurisdictions. Maybe two people come together and they claim jurisdiction over the same territory. God gives us a sense of what comes first, whose responsibilities come first. Now I'll say this, when those things clash, we need to not make them clash unless they have to. In Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, what the apostles are being told not to do is what God has explicitly told them they must do. And so when they say we must obey God rather than men, there is no way for them to comply with both, right? They can't not preach Jesus and also preach Jesus. But if the government says, here's something we're requiring of you, and what it does is make inconvenient what God has told us to do. That's not the same as telling you not to do what God has told you to do. And we need to know the distinctions, and those distinctions are very important, for instance, over the last year, that if we can comply, we ought to comply. So, what do we do to address injustices? Well, we make sure that it is within our realm, within our jurisdiction to be able to do something about that. I think that we have, as Americans, a very exercised sense of justice, and maybe in some cases an over-exercised sense of justice. Now, some people might find that shocking, but I do think that. And for instance, culturally speaking, we love vigilante movies, the heroes who take things into their own hands, go behind the scenes, go outside of the standard governing authorities and get people what they deserve. Batman is one of my favorite characters of that sort. And in one of the movies, well, in several of the movies and cartoons and comics, one of the things that constantly comes up is that very notion and that sense of, should something be done about somebody like this? And as much as I hate to say it, yes, Batman ought to be arrested. We don't want that in our community. For one thing, or really the main thing, is the depiction of him is always, he is perfect in his judgment. He never goes and gets a bad guy who's not really bad, does he? They're always really and truly rotten. But the fact of the matter is, if you had somebody who was actually like that, and he answered to no one, and he had no processes by which to process justice, he would be railroading all sorts of people left and right based on his own biases and his own opinions. There'd be no checks and balances. It's a very dangerous thing. And he's acting outside of his jurisdiction. And what God tells us is sometimes there's going to be injustices, and it is somebody's job to do it, and they may not do it as well as you would like. In fact, they may do it very poorly. But that doesn't mean God has then given you permission to take up the reins. That's when you say, God will take care of it. You say, well, there doesn't seem to be any other means. There's nothing else at my disposal. What else can I do? Nothing. That's right. There's nothing else you can do. People don't like that answer. People think there's always something else you can do. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes you set it down and say, that's all. I've done what I can. I will have to turn that over to God. Vengeance is his. He will repay. Well, we'll discuss some of that more as we go along in a later lesson. Another aspect of our limitation is that we're limited in what we can know. God is not limited here, but we are. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 3, Paul talks about the Corinthians who are judging him, and he says it's a very small thing. It's a small thing for me to be examined by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even examine myself, for I am conscious of nothing against myself, yet I am not by this acquitted, but the one who examines me is the Lord. We are imperfect in our knowledge even of what is in our own minds and lives. We certainly are imperfect in knowing what's in the other guy's mind and in his life. So what we end up having to do is go through processes by which we look for evidence, we try to make a case, and we try to see if there's enough evidence to convict. Sometimes there's not enough evidence to convict. Somebody says, what if he's guilty? But there's not enough evidence. Well, then we've gone outside of our ability, haven't we? I can't just say, I feel like he's probably guilty, and so we should probably do something. We're going to get to that more in just a minute. But understanding our limits of knowledge is a critical thing. Now, this goes both ways. Because on the other hand, as we do build a case, we often talk about this in our court system, and I think this is a biblical concept. What we're doing is trying to see if there's enough evidence to say someone is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And so we build some evidence, and all the evidence points in this direction. Somebody might say, well, there is this slim possibility. Maybe they got set up. Or maybe, there's a 1 in a million chance that this person is actually not guilty. The notion is not that we have to prove to God-like knowledge status that someone is guilty. Reasonable doubt is the only standard we can go by because we are limited. Somebody says, well, maybe you might convict somebody who's actually innocent. I want to suggest to you right now that God expects us to act on what we can know, not on what we cannot know. And when all the evidence points in one direction and somehow unknown to us, this person has actually been set up, but that couldn't be known by the people who are prosecuting the case, God does not expect us to act on perfect knowledge. He expects us to act on what we can know. So whether it is that somebody is let go even though they are guilty because of our imperfect knowledge, or even whether it's somebody's convicted who's actually innocent, if we are acting in good faith and sound principles, sound biblical judgment, that's what God expects us to do. Will there be mistakes? Yes. Go back to Romans chapter 12 and verse 19. God will right the wrongs. And I cannot say that we will move forth with perfect justice. we can move forth with faithful justice, faithful to God's word, but with the limitations that human beings will always have. We are limited to in how much justice we can actually dispense. This is a difficult thing. We want people to pay. We want people to, quote, get what they deserve. But sometimes the ability of someone to pay for what they've done is very limited. In Leviticus chapter 24, and beginning in verse 17, it says, "If a man takes the life of any human being, he shall surely be put to death. The one who takes the life of an animal shall make it good, life for life. If a man injures his neighbor, just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured a man, so shall it be inflicted on him. Thus the one who kills an animal shall make it good, but the one who kills a man shall be put to death. There shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as for the native. I am the Lord your God." So, you have a circumstance, and someone's been injured, and we have a one-for-one sort of, well, not sort of, but in fact, a one-for-one punishment system. What you have taken will be taken from you. Incidentally, when you are a thief, or when you take something with malice, then the payment goes up. In other words, it's not just you pay that back, but you pay it back times a certain amount. And depending on the crime, the repayment may not just be one for one. But God says, no, there's additional repayment that is required. But then what about life for life? Well, what if you've taken 2 lives? Now what? You don't get to take his life twice. I like the book True Grit. I've mentioned it a few times. One of the, I don't know, it's humorous parts, but it's interesting. This young girl, she wants justice for the murder of her father. And it's interesting in that story, she goes to this man who's going to track him down, and it turns out there's this Texas Ranger who's also tracking that same guy down because he murdered an official down in Texas. And she says, "No, I want him brought in, and I want him hung for the murder of my father." And he says, "Well, what do you care who he gets hung for?" And she goes, "I care that the justice is for my father. And they can go hang him after that for that guy." Well, they could, but it won't mean as much, will it? And I think sometimes we wish that there was more justice that could be extracted from a person. That we wish at the end of the day, people will say death is too good, and they're not wrong in some cases. But what else could we do? God can. God can extract more justice than you and I ever will, and he will. And so the people you think are getting off, they are not. God will be perfect in his justice. We will always be somewhat imperfect in our justice. And I just want to say this, that sometimes people will say things like, someone's coming out of jail after some long sentence, some murderer, some rapist, some vile offender. And they come out saying, "I've paid my debt to society." So often, I cringe. You have worked up a debt you could never pay. We all have. But here's this person who thinks that they've paid their debt to society because they spent a few years in a cell after ruining or destroying someone else's life. And I want to say to you, we can't devise a payment that would compensate for what you've taken. God can. And so we understand our limitations there. One other thing about limitations is that sometimes there is a result that we might categorize as unjust. A consequence, and we say this is not fair. But it doesn't mean that somebody has actually practiced injustice, that someone is to blame. Sometimes there's really no one to blame. Over in Exodus chapter 21, and verse 28, "If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall go unpunished. If, however, an ox was previously in the habit of goring, and its owner has been warned, yet does not confine it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall be put to death. So, you got a situation where you got the same circumstance. An ox goes, somebody's pet goes and kills somebody. What do? Well, here it lays it out. Maybe this is a new development. This is unknown to the owner, unknown to anyone. And it's not that there's no consequence. We're going to kill the animal. And that's going to cost that owner. I'm reminded of what we talked about with the cities of refuge and the cost that comes along even with killing accidentally. And I think there's a cost that's associated with this. But other than that, it says the owner shall go unpunished. But maybe he did know. But that's what we got to figure out. And if we figure out that he didn't know, then maybe the family member of the one who got gored feels like somebody ought to pay. But maybe there's nobody to pay. We live in a society that has a mantra, somebody ought to pay. We live in a litigious society where people get sued left and right. Somebody ought to pay. Why? Because I'm hurt. Yeah, but maybe nobody's to blame. It may not be anybody's fault. Things happen. And things happen, yes, maybe you were using that person's equipment, but the fact that it malfunctioned doesn't mean that they had malice or were trying to kill you, or that they're responsible for the malfunction of that thing. Now you might say, well, maybe they are. Okay. But that's what we got to figure out. And if they're not, then we may just have to lay it down and say nobody's at fault. We don't like nobody being at fault. We want somebody to be at fault. That's not justice. Sometimes the result is going to be unjust. Sometimes there are going to be sad and difficult consequences to just simply the world that we live in. And who's going to pay for that? Nobody here. Will God set things right? You better believe it. And people who deserve better than they got here will get better than they got here. Paul suffered many injustices, some of them caused by people, some of them not. Some of them were storms. It's not fair. Paul doesn't deserve this. You ever say that kind of thing? Why does this always happen to me? Because you live on a planet where those things happen all the time. And we want to put a face to it. And I'll tell you what, if we're not careful, not only do we want to put a human face to it, but eventually people want to even put God's face to it. Because if they can't find somebody to blame here, they'll eventually start looking there. Maybe it's his fault. And a number of people have gotten mad at God and eventually dismissed the existence of God because they couldn't come to terms with the notion that unfairness simply exists. Inequality exists. And it does not always exist because some sinister plot is behind it all. That's part of accepting and understanding justice, I believe. Well, then there is the idea of presumed innocence. Presumed innocence is a part of our American justice system, and it is not a part of every justice system. But can I suggest to you, it is not just an American concept, but the idea of presumption of innocence is a biblical concept. I believe it is established, like many of our judicial principles are established on biblical concepts, and this is certainly one of those. Number one, accusations are not they're not proof. They're merely opinions until proof is actually given. We see Paul appealing to this very principle in Acts chapter 24. In Acts chapter 24 and in verse 13, it says, as he is giving his defense here, he says to Felix, Let's begin in verse 12. Neither in the temple nor in the synagogues nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot, nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. Paul is saying it's not good enough for them to just say that I did this. They actually need to bring some proof. Where is it? And if there is no proof, then you cannot say, I am guilty of these things. He offers some evidence to the contrary, but he also puts the burden on them. And that is, we call it the burden of proof. The burden of proof is on the accuser. In order to know the truth, we have to examine all sides. You don't just come and you hear an accusation, you go, well, I've heard what I need to hear. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 17, which I think is, just a critical passage when it comes to being just and exercising justice. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 17, the first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. I don't want you to just be thinking in terms of an actual judicial system, though that certainly would apply there as well, but thinking in terms of the court of public opinion. We've got a nonstop supply of one-sided accusations anytime we want them. You turn on any version of the news, you turn on any version of social media, somebody's going to be accused of something. And depending on where you are, you're going to either be inclined to accept that or reject that. What you're generally not inclined to do is then go say, let me find out more about this. It's like you just read that headline. And there you go. It's exactly what I thought. Or, I don't believe that. And there's not actual thorough investigation, but we form our opinions and then we go share it and we continue to spread the accusations as if they have been proven. We must examine and hear all sides. The evidence must be strong. It must be more than a single testimony. The Bible is explicit. It is explicit concerning this principle. In Deuteronomy chapter 19 and in verse 15, Deuteronomy 19 and verse 15, a single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. It is not enough. It is not saying this in general terms. Over and over it says one witness is not enough. I don't care who the witness is. It's not enough. You have to have 2 or 3 witnesses. Over in 2 Corinthians chapter 13. No. 2 Corinthians chapter 13. It's just one place where we see this repeated in the New Testament. Paul says, this is the 3rd time I am coming to you. Every fact is to be confirmed by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. We see it in Matthew chapter 18. We see it as Paul talks about even himself making sure he has 2 or 3 witnesses on the other side, as he's carrying with him witnesses to show that his conduct is above board. Over and over, that idea of making sure we have an established testimony. We'll talk later about what sort of witnesses are needed, but that the number of them is so emphasized. I'll tell you what, we live in a world where it just takes one person saying something about somebody and their life is ruined. The whole crowd will jump in. 2 or 3 witnesses? No. All we need is 2 or 3 witnesses saying that they believe this person, and wildfire. That person can be stricken from the public records. We need to be careful that we're not a party to it, that we don't participate in such a thing. Silence cannot be considered as proof of guilt of the person being accused. I think about this particular principle. It is one that I had not considered especially. Because when I think of the right to remain silent, I generally think as criminals getting protection. You think of Miranda rights, and here people, we want to make sure that the criminals don't sort of out themselves. Well, I understand that. I understand there's some perversions of this or any number of protections. But the protection is actually for the innocent party. In Matthew chapter 26, that Caleb read for us a little while ago, Matthew 26, in the beginning of verse 60, it says, they did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. No testimony to bring against him. It says, but later on, 2 came forward and said, this man stated, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. The high priest stood up and said to him, do you not answer? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Now what we have here is a no-win situation. You don't answer? Look, can't even answer the charges. That's not proof of his guilt. It's proof of his dismissal of the legitimacy of anything that they're saying. But then he presses, speak. And so he does speak. And then what do? They twist that and turn it around. When somebody's goal is to prove that you are guilty, speaking can very often be problematic. It can come to a point where there's nothing you can say that is actually helpful, that will be convincing. And so there's an appropriate time to remain silent. And it's not okay to take somebody's silence and say, by their silence, we know that they're guilty. Now, I understand that there's difficulty if somebody remains silent when you feel like, why aren't you speaking? But that alone is not enough. There must be actual evidence. So silence in and of itself cannot convict. A lot of charges being thrown around in the public about behaviors. The word racism gets thrown around. The word hatred and bigotry gets thrown around a lot. Am I guilty if I don't vocally address every one of those accusations? There are some people that would say yes. I say, no, I don't have to address all of those. I am perfectly willing to be judged on the conduct of my life. I am perfectly willing for people to go find witnesses and see if they can convict me of those things, but I'm not about to engage in that kind of silly conversation where I say I have to go prove that I'm not what these people who don't even know me would say that I am. Now, I'm not interested in that. That doesn't mean I'm guilty. And it doesn't mean that Jesus is guilty just because he holds his tongue in the face of accusers who he knows are not sincere in their methodologies. I think that we particularly need to keep this kind of thing in mind, the presumption of innocence, when we are negatively disposed towards someone who is the accused. These things are guards. They are guards on behalf of the actually innocent person, because we have our own biases and prejudices, and so they are guards against us, against our own difficulties in seeing truth. We have checks and balances against our own overzealousness maybe at prosecution, but maybe we're on the other end. They're protections for us if we are innocently accused, falsely accused. It is interesting to me that as the Jewish court here in Matthew chapter 26, even as they're only giving lip service to the sort of laws that God would put in place, even lip service kind of trips them up. It's a speed bump. It doesn't ultimately keep them from convicting Jesus, but it kind of does slow them down, doesn't it? Like they're trying to find some, why don't they just say, look, we think he's guilty, that's it. No, they feel like they've got to prove something. And so they got to go get some witnesses. They got to come up with something, right? We can't just say he's guilty. Now, ultimately, they're willing to accept less than valid testimony. Ultimately, they're willing to twist his words and throw accusations against him that are not valid. But they feel it necessary to at least go through those motions. And I want to suggest to you that even going through the motions helps in some sense. We want to do better than that. So what we want to do is give that protection. If somebody says, in giving those protections to the innocent, might we also inadvertently give protections to the guilty? It's possible. In fact, I think it's probable that that will happen. That goes back to our limitations. And what I am particularly concerned about is on the scale of, am I going to convict somebody who's innocent, or am I going to set free somebody who's guilty? I think that the biblical mandates lean in the direction of be even more careful that you don't convict the innocent. Are you likely to let some guilty go? Yes, that's a consequence of that. You do that with the confidence that God will out all of that. He will take care of that in the end. But it keeps me from condemning the innocent and leaving that to God. I realize that we still have the responsibility to convict the guilty. And I'm not in any way suggesting that we are off the hook in that manner, that there will be responsibility when we have the power and the jurisdiction and the responsibility and we let the guilty go. God is clear on that as well. But again, limits in both directions. The thing that is most encouraging about all of this is that God is not limited. That he knows precisely who is guilty and who is innocent, and just how guilty and how innocent. And he will ultimately set right all that we cannot. But even though he has every right to merely pronounce our guilt, I am struck all through Scripture that he goes about making the case. And he shows us time and again that he brings witnesses. And multiple witnesses. And he makes the case and he lays it out and says, you are guilty. Oh, let me just put it all in a court of law. And you do stand accused, but not just, like Job saying, let me stand before my accuser. God essentially in so many ways gives people the opportunity. Stand here and let me lay out the evidence for you. He holds up the perfect law of liberty as testimony against us. We, if we are honest, are every one of us convicted. So we stand accused and we stand convicted. All that remains is the price to be paid. He will have justice and he will have it paid in full. But mercifully, as we stand before the judge who has accused and convicted us, he also offers to pay. He will pay the price and justice will remain intact. But would you allow him to pay your debt? Or would you submit elsewise to the justice that only he can extract? And it will be worse than anything that this earth can extract. As Jesus says to his disciples that he sends out in Matthew chapter 10, do not fear man who can only kill the body. Fear God who is able to destroy both the body and the soul in hell. That is a justice that I think none of us should contemplate that we want to face. But if you would allow him to pay that price of justice, if you would submit to him this morning, we would encourage you to do so. We would assist you in any way that we can if you'll come forward while we stand and while we sing.